thanking you, Dr. Flannes, for speaking at such a wonderfully measured pace. The connections between the British Museum and the Teylers Museum are very long-standing. And indeed, the physical form of the British Museum owes a great deal to this house. In 1801, during that brief moment of peace on the continent, when it was possible for British visitors to come to the continent, the young Robert Smirke, the architect, came to the Teylers Museum, was so impressed by the oval room that he took it home in his head as the model of what a museum ought to be. And when, 30 years later, he designed the King's Library, the Enlightenment Gallery for the British Museum, he took as his model the oval room of the Teylers Museum. And it was therefore very appropriate that when the British Library moved out, and we had to renew that building, Andrew Burnett, my colleague who was here, came back and signed in the same visitor's book in 2001, 200 years later, when he came to decide how we would remodel the Enlightenment Gallery, again on the pattern of the oval room. But it does make the point, I think, that right from the beginning, what we're talking about in the opening, the making of a museum like this one, is an event which has political, intellectual, and social repercussions. These institutions are profoundly political in their intention. They are conceived to change citizens, to make a certain kind of society. And it's through these institutions that our societies have become what they are. And it's through the similarities and the differences in our societies, in our museums, and in our intellectual pattern that we can understand why we are now what we are. I think it's always been a source of fascination that in the Enlightenment, the French produced a book, the Encyclopédie. The Dutch and the British collected things. You couldn't have a clearer demonstration of two different ways of thinking about the world. And you could, I think, argue, if we were going to be speculative, that four of the great surviving monuments of the Enlightenment that still physically survive are the Encyclopédie, the Teylers Museum, the British Museum, and the Constitution of the United States of America. They are the four surviving witnesses to that great, great moment. But it's also about something else, because what the idea of a public, totally public museum, open to everybody, expresses is the idea of an intellectual and an emotional optimism of what a society can become if it's rooted in learning. And that's what both the British Museum and the Teylers Museum, in each case, refer to really public museum in their countries. That's what they're both trying to achieve. Teylers always does it in a very different way, but in a perhaps even more remarkable way. The idea of keeping this collection permanently together to be available for study, he decides to achieve, of course, through his trustees, his testamentary will, the trustees. And Teylers' will must be one of the great documents, I think, of the Protestant Enlightenment. And this is, I think, also one of the great differences, of course, between Western Europe and Northern Europe, that our Enlightenment is never in opposition to the Church as a point of principle. It's one of the most striking things I found reading Teylers' will, the mixing of the religious, the social, the money given for charitable purposes, for the orphans, for the religious communities, and for learning, and above all, for that wonderful notion that in learning people will enjoy themselves by coming together. The phrase I found most moving, and I'm going to try to read very slowly in Dutch, from his will, is when he talks about the idea of gathering together people who are liefhebbers van en ervaren in de natuur, licht historien, tegen, binnenkunde. That, we hope this is a tradition, Marianne, that you're going to keep out. And we all hope that we're going to meet again soon in Stockholm to celebrate. And next time we come, you will be up here somewhere. And that great tradition of scholarship is continued not now in the coins and in the drawings and in the other areas of the museum's activities. A great house like this is, of course, a remarkable phenomenon just by its physical survival, but it is also important because it represents something. It stands for a set of ideals which have rarely been more clearly articulated and which were unusually achieved, realized and preserved. It was very admirable, I thought, that the book to appear recently on Tyler was called The Ideals of Mr. Tyler. There can be few institutions that so fully embody a set of ideals, ideals to which I think we would all still be happy to subscribe, and which do still stand for a vision of what a society ought to be, and how knowledge should take its place in society and help shape that society. And I think that's why this moment is such an important one, not just for Ireland or the Netherlands, but for the whole of Europe. Because we've rarely more needed this reaffirmation of the role of serious study in our societies. A museum is not a place of entertainment. It is a place where people come to think about themselves in the context of the past, a place where the boundary between public and private dissolves so that the public realm in the museum becomes the private possession of every citizen, achieved here as almost nowhere else, and one of the great distinguishing characteristics of this house. In the archaeology of knowledge in the European tradition, there are very few monuments that have survived intact. Most of the great collections, museums, galleries have been destroyed, modified, changed. This is one of the very, very few that has survived. And that's why I hope it will be possible at some point for this museum to be designated a World Heritage Site. Because this is a critical part of European heritage. This is one of the great things that Europe thought, believed in, and in this